Every February, hundreds of millions of people exchange cards and flowers for a holiday of romance, never knowing that its shadow reaches back to something far stranger and far older. For centuries in ancient Rome, the middle of February belonged to a festival so raw, so physical, so at odds with everything a later age wanted to believe about civilization, that the church spent generations trying to stamp it out and replace it. Its priests sacrificed animals in a sacred cave, smeared blood on the foreheads of young men, then ran nearly naked through the heart of the city, striking the crowds, and especially the women, with strips of freshly cut hide, in a rite believed to bring fertility. It was called lupercalia, and it was one of the oldest and most beloved festivals in Rome, so deeply rooted that it survived the rise of Christianity itself by a full century. This is a story of that forbidden festival and of the long, deliberate effort to erase it from the calendar and from memory, an effort that left one clue hiding in plain sight. To understand Lupercalia, you have to go back to the very origin of Rome itself, to a cave and a wolf. Rome's founding legend centered on the twins Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants, and in the myth, suckled and kept alive by a she-wolf in a cave at the foot of the Palatine hill. That cave, called the Lupercal, was one of the most sacred sites in the city, the mythic cradle of Rome, the place where the future founders were saved from death by a wild animal, and the February festival took its name and its spirit from that same root, from the lupus, the wolf. Lupercalia was, at its core, a ritual of purification and fertility tied to the wild, untamed origins of the Roman people, older than the marble and the empire, reaching back to a time when Rome was still just shepherds on a cluster of hills. The festival was overseen by special colleges of priests known as the Luperci, the brothers of the wolf. Unlike the solemn, dignified state priesthoods, the Luperci were associated with something more primal, more physical, even a little disreputable. Each year in the middle of February, on the 15th, they gathered at the sacred cave to begin the rites. This was not a quiet, orderly civic ceremony. It was a festival with one foot still in Rome's wild prehistory, and the Romans loved it precisely because of that. It connected them to who they had been before the togas and the Senate and the aqueducts, to the raw, animal vitality at the source of their city. For century after century, through the rise of the Republic and the height of the Empire, Lupercalia was celebrated without interruption. It was still going strong when Rome ruled the entire Mediterranean world from Britain to the sands of Syria. And that extraordinary longevity, a festival that had run continuously for the better part of 1,000 years, is exactly what would later make it so nearly impossible to kill. Here's what actually happened in the streets of Rome each February, described plainly because the strangeness is the entire point. The rites began at the sacred cave with sacrifice. The Luperci sacrificed animals and goats, associated with fertility and raw sexual energy, and a dog. Then came a sequence of ritual acts recorded by ancient writers, including the biographer Plutarch. The foreheads of two young men of the Luperci were touched with the bloody sacrificial knife, and the blood was then immediately wiped away with wool that had been dipped in milk. Blood and milk, death and life, joined in a single gesture, after which the two youths were required to laugh. It was a ritual of symbolic death and rebirth, staged on the living faces of young men. Then the priests took the hides of the sacrificed goats and cut them into strips. These strips were called the Februa, and that word matters enormously because it means instruments of purification. And it is the very root from which the month of February takes its name. February is quite literally the month of ritual purification, named for the thongs of goatskin used in this one festival. Wearing little more than a covering cut from the goatskins, the Luperci then ran a course through the city, laughing and lashing out with these strips of hide at the people they passed. And women in particular are said to have come forward deliberately to be struck because it was believed that a blow from the Februa would make a woman fertile and ease the pains of childbirth. Far from fleeing the half-naked runners, women offered themselves to the lash, hoping for children. To Roman eyes, this was not violence and it was not shameful. It was a blessing, a physical, tangible transfer of fertility and purification from the sacred rite directly into the bodies of the city and its people. The near nakedness of the runners, the blood, the striking, the laughter, every element carried meaning within a worldview, where the sacred and the bodily were not walled off from each other, the way a later age would insist they must be. It was one of the most popular days of the entire Roman year, and there is a famous political moment attached to it, one that places Lupercalia at the center of Roman history's most fateful drama. According to the ancient accounts, at the Lupercalia, held shortly before the assassination of Julius Caesar, his lieutenant Mark Antony, himself running that day as one of the Luperci, approached Caesar in the forum and offered him a diadem, a crown, the symbol of kingship that Rome officially despised. Caesar, reading the uneasy, disapproving silence of the crowd, pushed it away, and the crowd roared its approval. This piece of political theater, staged in the middle of the wild fertility festival, became part of the tension that led, within weeks, to the daggers on the Ides of March. The festival was so central to Roman public life that the turning point of the Republic played out in its streets. Now the erasure, the long, stubborn struggle to end a festival that simply refused to end. When Christianity rose and eventually became the dominant religion of the Roman world, it inherited a calendar crowded with ancient pagan festivals, and it set about over generations replacing, absorbing, or suppressing them one by one. Most gave way in time. But Lupercalia was different. It was so old, so woven into the very identity of Rome, so genuinely beloved by the ordinary people of the city, that it persisted deep into the Christian era, still being celebrated in Rome even a full century after the empire had officially embraced the new faith. People who by then considered themselves Christians were, it seems, still turning out every February for the ancient rites of the wolf. The gravitational pull of a thousand-year tradition did not simply switch off because the official religion at the top had changed. The decisive confrontation came from the highest level of the church. Toward the end of the 5th century, a pope, Julius I, moved to end Lupercalia once and for all. In a surviving letter, he confronted members of the Roman aristocracy who wanted to keep the old festival alive, and he condemned the rite in forceful terms, insisting it had no place among Christian people and mocking the idea that these pagan runners were preserving the city. The specific details of his argument mattered less than the sheer fact of it. Here was the head of the Roman Church, a full 100 years into the Christian Empire, still fighting hard to stamp out a pagan fertility festival, because it would not die on its own. That single letter is a monument to how deep Lupercalia's roots ran. You do not need to fight that hard against a dying thing. There is a long-standing popular claim that Julius replaced Lupercalia directly with a Christian feast, the feast of St. Valentine in mid-February, and that this is the true origin of our association of that season with love and romance. Here honesty is essential. Historians are genuinely divided on this, and the direct link is far from proven. Serious scholars have argued that the connection between Valentine's Day and romantic love actually emerged much later, in the medieval period, through the world of courtly love poetry, and had little or nothing to do with the ancient festival. So we should not overstate it, but the deeper truth underneath the debate is not really in dispute. The middle of February had been Rome's charged season of purification and fertility for 1,000 years, and the cultural memory of that association proved remarkably durable. Something about that time of year kept its charge, even after the rite that first gave it that charge was gone. Why did the church work so hard for so long to end this one particular festival? And why has it nearly vanished from popular memory today? The answer lies in what Lupercalia represented. It was, in almost every respect, the opposite of everything the new religious order wanted to build. It was bodily, where the new faith prized the spiritual and the restrained. It was rooted in animal sacrifice and raw fertility magic, where the new faith preached self-denial. It celebrated the wild, pre-civilized, pagan origin of Rome at the exact moment when the culture was straining to redefine itself around an entirely different set of values and a different founding story. A festival of blood-smeared, near-naked priests striking women with strips of hide to make them fertile could not simply be softened and quietly absorbed the way some milder, pagan customs were folded into the Christian calendar. It was too vivid, too physical, too obviously pagan. It had to be confronted directly and stamped out. And stamping out a tradition that ancient and that popular requires not a single command but a sustained, generations-long campaign, which is exactly what the historical record shows. And once it was finally gone, the erasure was remarkably thorough. Because Lupercalia belonged to the losing side of a vast religious transition, the people who wrote and preserved the surviving history had every reason to let it fade quietly into obscurity. What remained were scattered descriptions in older pagan authors, a pope's letter of condemnation, and a single silent fossil hiding in plain sight in every calendar on earth, the name of the month itself. February still carries, buried in its own name, the memory of the goatskin thongs of a wild fertility rite that almost no one alive has ever heard of. To really grasp why Lupercalia lived where it did on the calendar, you have to understand what February was to the Romans, because it was not the ordinary month we think of today. It was the strangest, most sacred, most unsettling stretch of the entire Roman year. The very name February comes, as we've seen, from the Februa and the idea of ritual purification, but the whole month was given over to that theme. February was Rome's great season of cleansing, of settling accounts with the dead and with the gods before the new year began, in an older calendar in which the year turned around the coming of spring. And packed into this same month was a series of solemn rites for the dead. There was a multi-day festival, the Parentalia, during which Roman families honored their deceased ancestors, visited the tombs of their parents and forebears, and brought offerings of food, flowers, and wine to the graves. During this period, the ancient sources tell us, temples were closed, marriages were not to be performed, and magistrates set aside the symbols of their office. The whole city entered a hushed, liminal state, its attention turned toward the dead. The Parentalia culminated in a day, the Feralia, dedicated to appeasing the spirits of the departed and keeping them content, so that the restless dead would not trouble the living. So place Lupercalia back into that context and it snaps into focus. This was a month about purification, fertility, the dead, and the fragile boundary between the living and the departed. A month of cleansing the community and renewing life as one cycle ended and another began. Lupercalia, with its blood and its milk, its symbolic death and rebirth of the young Luperci, its lashes to bring fertility and ease childbirth, was a fertility and purification rite sitting in the middle of the year's great purification season, surrounded by rituals of death and renewal. It was not a random burst of wildness. It was the beating, primal heart of the most sacred month Rome had, and that is another reason it was so hard to kill. To erase Lupercalia was to tear a hole in the deep structure of the Roman year itself, a structure so old that even its own name outlived the empire that built it. When you strike at something that load-bearing, the whole edifice resists, which is exactly why the effort took a full century and the personal intervention of a pope to finally succeed. So this February, when the cards and the flowers appear in every shop window, know that the season's deep association with fertility and love is far older than any of it, that it runs back through a suppressed papal battle and 1,000 years of tradition, to a festival of blood, hide, and laughter in the streets of ancient Rome. Lupercalia was one of the oldest things Rome had, a rite reaching all the way back to the wolf in the cave at the city's mythic founding, and it took the church a full century, and a pope's direct intervention to finally erase it. And it very nearly worked. Almost nothing of the festival survives in the popular memory of the modern world. Almost nothing, except the name of the very month it lived and died in. If you like the real history hiding underneath the things you thought you understood, subscribe. Every few days we pull another buried practice back into the light, because some traditions weren't simply forgotten with the passage of time, they were erased on purpose by people who wanted them gone. And a few of them, like this one, still left a fingerprint behind, waiting in plain sight for anyone who knows where to look.